Lovely to see you all. And I don't know how you've normally been doing the Shema, whether you've been sharing the screen or like to learn, like look at a piece of text together, or to like go through it. I know I sent round the link. I can actually attach it in the chat. I can probably send a PDF. Let me just see if I can do that for anyone who wants to.
I've sent it. I've emailed it to everybody. I've emailed it to everybody.
I've just found, I know I've experimented with various different types of Zoom shiurim, and have found that it's easier to see people's faces, to know whether there's engagement or not, and might like jump to the screen share for a particular piece of text. But otherwise, I mean, I've got my printouts here. If you've got a copy with you, that's fine. If not, you can follow along with what we'll be discussing. But just it's much easier to notice what's going on in the room, so to speak, with the FaceTime up. I am getting a little bit of feedback, just echo. I don't know if anyone else is as well.
Yes.
But maybe mute your speakers, unless if you want to say something, that's absolutely fine. But otherwise, keep them off, just so that we don't get feedback and echo. Thanks, Kenny, for inviting me to give the share this morning. I could have never have dreamed in all my years at Hendon that I'd be giving a Tosh Shema share when Tottenham were top of the league. but the day has come. But the title of today's share, who should be the first to get the COVID-19 vaccine? I thought just to explore ideas in terms of how we would prioritize things. And again, this isn't a halachic ruling. We know the truth is we don't have a huge amount of say in how things are going to happen, but it's good to just take any new scenario like this and try and think it through with Torah eyes, get a bit of a perspective, look through some of the sources, and we'll see there's a difference between the public and the kind of individual perspective way of looking at this. So even though this might not have the most practical relevance today, I thought it would just be nice to take a topical discussion point. It's wonderful news that there are so many vaccines, or that there are various vaccines which now look like they're almost ready to be available. Hopefully will allow us to go back to somewhat of a normal life in the not too distant future. So just a look at how we might go about prioritizing giving out a vaccine from a Jewish perspective. Right. So the first, and as I say, please do as we go along. If you've got any comments or discussions, feel free to either unmute and raise them or mention them in the chat. Oh, hi, Joe.
I would have thought that it's obvious that the first people you want to give it to are the Iranians.
Yeah. Yeah. Shall wait? Maybe shall wait a couple of minutes if people might still be coming in before we. I know just if we would still be in the Hardman the suite, we'd still be having our coffee at this stage. If it's going to take a couple of minutes just for anyone else to come, I can happy to hold off. But while we have our coffee, just till we kick into sources. Yeah. Right. Hi, Alan. Nice to see you.
Well, nice to see you too, Rabbi Binstock. How are you?
Very well, thanks. So the first thing I brought down there was just wasn't any kind of Torah source, but it was just the BBC article, or lifted from the BBC article a couple of days ago, where they said, who's going to get the coronavirus first, and how soon can I have it? To which they reported that it depends on how old you are. As age is the biggest risk factor here for severe COVID-19. And in the UK, older care home residents and care home staff are top of the preliminary priority list. They're followed by health workers, such as hospital staff and the over 80s. And then people are then ranked by age, with people under 50 at the bottom of the list. So that was the news article a couple of weeks ago. So just thought, that's the kind of the government have taken a look at this and say we've got this disease which we still know relatively little about compared to so many other diseases. We've got a vaccine which we know relatively little about, but it does seem that the people at highest risk are those in care homes, and by extension, their workers, their carers, and therefore, the priority of administering a vaccine would be looked at in that regard. So to begin with, I wanted to look at like the question of, does the health of the public outweigh the health of an individual? And I guess I first was struck by this question when, well, I guess if you've ever noticed them, I don't know when the last time they did, replant the flowers in Hendon Park. A lovely flower garden then, just as you come in. And I remember once thinking, walking past there and seeing a couple of council workers putting in some beautiful new flowers in the flower beds there, which is lovely. And it's great because you walk through the park and there's pretty flowers there. But we also hear the whole time about how they're making cuts in hospitals and there's a shortage of funds for the NHS and all things like that. And kind of weighing up the dilemma of, on the one hand, the council are happy to spend money planting flowers in the garden, and there's a shortage of beds in hospitals. So how are we balancing that? And when you look at it in almost a very individualistic perspective, yeah, how could you do that? Like if it was our own home, so to speak, having a bed at home would be far more important than having flowers in the garden. But when a society is looking at something, the overall health and well-being of the society is really important. And that includes having nice spaces for society to be able to enjoy recreation, such as a park with flowers. So although it might be almost, when you like kind of weigh them up almost like on a very individualistic balance and say, we'll put this on one side of the scale and that on the other side of the scale, what's more important, flowers in the park or a hospital bed? Everyone would rather a hospital bed on an individual case-by-case basis. Once we're looking at things as a society, the leadership of a society has to look at the overall well-being and budget for all areas. Because if we had a society where there were only hospital beds and no parks, we'd have a very unhealthy society. So those things are...
Can I take your question and turn it a little bit? It's interesting because I read your question in a quite different way. I mean, the question you've put is a fascinating one about balance, if you like, between society's need. That's fine. But there's a much more precise question, which is actually going to require, I suspect, a halakhic opinions on, and that is that, and this came up and probably still exists in context of the measles vaccines. In other words, and particularly it's coming up where you've got highly transmittable diseases, and that is that where you have groups of people, let's say they're all Jews, forget about non-Jews for the moment, groups of Jews, certain groups of Jews who say, I'm not going to take the vaccine. I'm happy to take the risk for myself and my family. But the reality is, I think many of the experts will say, is that you need to have a very high uptake of the vaccine. I think I read in the Sunday Times, something like 70% plus, maybe more, if you're going to get any kind of herd immunity and eliminate the problem in the first place. So that's your question, taken in a much more precise way. Should, in fact, for example, the rabbis be saying to the Jewish community, you don't have the option, you are halakhically bound to take up, unless you've got specific medical reasons why you're at risk, you should be taking up this vaccine, because otherwise we put at risk the whole community.
It's a very good point, and I would have hoped that we wouldn't even need to be saying that. Now, I do know that there is an anti-vax movement who don't believe in vaccines, but having just seen what's gone on in the world in the past few months, like I know like the government have the same issue. I almost to some extent don't want to engage with that argument, almost to give any kind of validity to the other side, because yeah, it's so obvious that the need for a vaccine, the need for some kind of herd immunity, and the necessity for people to be vaccinated in order to be able to do that, to start engaging with the other side of that argument possibly gives it more credence than might be worthwhile. But I would say it goes without saying that just like, we weigh up things in a bigger perspective in terms of the individual and society, that there's never been a better example of how, as an individual, you can affect society both positively and negatively by how you walk around in the street. Because if you have a choice of either vaccinating or not vaccinating, or even before we get onto the vaccine, whether it's wearing a mask, and I know that there was, a mask isn't the most straightforward, just taken on in and of itself, but whether you act safely and responsibly in public, we've seen how it affects other people's lives. And there's no better message than any of us could have had, that if you like, the butterfly effect, our individual actions, if we do the right thing, whether or not someone else is looking, if you're walking past the bus stop and you sneeze and you touch the bus stop seat there, no one else may see that, and it might be a minor, small, irrelevant action, but it actually might not. You actually could be spreading a disease to hundreds, if not thousands, of vulnerable people as a result of that. So that's definitely something which we need to take on board when we're looking at both the individual and communal perspective of this. But the first source I wanted to look at was actually a Gemara, which we're going to see. It might not look from the outset as to have anything to do with individual versus communal responsibility when it comes to Pikuach Nefesh. And that's why I say normally whenever I give a Gemara source, I like to add in the in-between lines, all the additional bits which help explain the words, because you can translate the Gemara word for word and often not be clear on its meaning. If you like, the non-bold text in the Art Scroll or the Steinsaltz or the Sefaria, which has got a very good, just so you know that there's some great online resources for studying Gemara and making it more meaningful. I have removed virtually all of them for this text because I want to look at it just as to what the words are saying, to almost read it in two different ways. So this is the Gemara in Shabbos 42a. Where we say, V'ha Amar Shmuel. Didn't Shmuel teach us? One may extinguish a piece of white hot metal in the public area on Shabbos, so that the masses will not be injured. However, one may not extinguish a red hot wooden coal. So the Gemara is drawing a distinction between a metal coal, which whether it's a piece of glowing metal and a piece of glowing wood, as to whether you can extinguish them on Shabbos. Now, if you read any of the translations and explanations, they will give you the reason. I'm happy to put it out there to you. If I haven't given you a reason, why might you have thought there should be a difference between wood and metal when it comes to extinguishing them on Shabbos? The primary source of the malacha, of the restriction for extinguishing fire on Shabbos, comes from remember the 39 malachas are creative work forms rather than destructive. And so putting out a fire would seem to be almost like you're stopping the fire, you're destroying a fire, but it becomes creative because they used to want to make charcoal. And the way you make charcoal is by putting out the fire. Obviously, you've got to light a piece of wood, you've got to allow it to burn for a suitable amount of time so that it becomes charcoal. I'm no expert on this, but my next door neighbor here in Hale is. He's got a wood-fired house, and he tells me that the best time to buy firewood is in the summer, because that's when nobody wants it. I never knew that people wanted it in the winter, but some of them do. In order for the wood to be most efficient in a fire, it needs to either be dried out or, say, again, no expert, but charcoal, particularly when it comes to fire lighting, is of particular use. And charcoal is essentially partly burned wood. So you've got to light the fire and you've got to extinguish it. So extinguishing a wooden glowing coal is creating charcoal. So there are most of the commentators look at this piece of Gemara and say, well, Shmuel is drawing a distinction between wood and metal because the wood is the Torah prohibition, because you're creating charcoal. By extinguishing a glowing wooden coal, what you're left with is a piece of useful charcoal. And you've ticked all the boxes of the Torah prohibition of creating charcoal through extinguishing a flame on Shabbos. Whereas extinguishing a piece of burning metal, there's nothing which you are actively, creatively doing which would kind of synchronize exactly with the Torah prohibition. It would be a rabbinic prohibition. And so the reason why Shmuel is allowing one and prohibiting the other is because one is biblical and one is rabbinic. And that's how many would read this Gemara, but not the Bahag. Which is why I kind of removed the in-between lines so we can look at it again. And I've quoted from the Ramban here, who says, he quotes the kind of the standard explanation, and then he says, Aval Bahag motzasi gabe gecheres shel eitz lesbo hezek rabim. So this is in the writings of the Bahag. Bahag, the Baal Halachos Gedolos, one of the early Rishonim, so again predates the Ramban, one of the early medieval commentators. He wants to draw the distinction between wood and metal, not from being something which is rabbinic or a Torah prohibition. He says rather, my Tama, it says Tama de Kovi is Besumka. So he says with regards to a wooden coal, there's no concern of danger to the public, since if it's not extinguished, it's besumka, it's glowing red. Anyone who is familiar with their Mediterranean spices might recognize sumka being very similar in its etymology to sumac, which is a glowing red spice. So that's just, if you like, a little bit of background in terms of the nature of the word sumka being glowing red. But you've got a wooden coal, it's sumka, it's glowing red, because chazule, people are going to see it, people are going to notice it, below is chazikba, and they're not going to touch it. Avol bat gacheres shel mateches, a metal coal, so to speak. Afal gab the ozol sumka kalya. Even once it stopped glowing, it still remains hot. People won't see it, they'll touch it, and they'll get damaged. So he's saying the difference between the danger to the public with regards to a piece of glowing metal and a piece of glowing wood is actually what's being discussed here. And whilst with a wooden coal, it's very noticeable, it's glowing, and once the embers die down, it's no longer so dangerous. With metal, yes, it can glow red when it's heated, but it still retains its heat for much longer. And the discussion taking place is of what is going to be dangerous to the public. And the Ran, which I forgot to add to the quotes here, he quotes the opinion of this Bahag, of what the Ramban is saying. He says that what's being discussed is, it says if a metal coal is a d'oraisa, he says both of them would be d'oraisa, would be of Torah prohibition. How can you justify violating Shabbos to extinguish them? He says it's because the Bahag is of the opinion that this is a public danger here. A glowing coal in the street, a glowing wooden coal wouldn't be a public danger because you can see it. But if there's an invisible public danger, then that's far more dangerous. And if you know about it, you should do whatever you can to put it out. So I thought I'd share that with you because I think it's a fascinating source, particularly when we're talking about an invisible public danger. The idea of drawing a distinction between a visible public danger, which everyone is aware of, and you can see it. I'm saying I know people have drawn a lot of analogies to the war years and the years which we've been going through, and all the people I've been speaking to about it, who remember the war years, said like the big difference between that is like the danger there was very tangible. And you heard air raid sirens, and you heard the bombs, and you saw the tangible danger there because there were bombs falling. And here there aren't, but there is nonetheless an invisible danger. And what the Baha'i is teaching us is that we actually are duty bound to take more care of an invisible public danger, specifically if we're responsible for it. If for whatever reason, if you know of this glowing piece of metal in the public, even if it would be something which you otherwise normally wouldn't extinguish on Shabbos because it might be visible to other people, and you'd expect people to walk around it. If it is something which people could touch and would be harmed as a result of it, then you're duty bound to extinguish the danger even on Shabbos. So I find this piece of Gemara, and in particular the Bahag's reading of it, incredibly relevant to the situation we find ourselves in today, which is why I want to share it first. And it's a lovely reminder of the timeless nature of Talmud study. And so by Talmud study, the idea of studying the oral tradition, which I know it's linked to the Mishnah and Gemara, but the idea that we have the written Torah and then we have the oral conversation, which goes with that, which is basically taking the principles, making sure that we're clear on the principles and applying them to today's situation. It's remarkable to see how we're able to do that by looking at the breadth of the discussion of rabbinic literature throughout the years and applying it to today's situation. So the next source is with Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in Minchas Shlomo, who's written extensively about this kind of area, about diseases and pandemics and epidemics, and he almost compares it to a war, in terms of its halachic nature. And the source on page 2 is discussing how, in a question he was asked about how kind of the governments have the right almost to determine the right procedures of how vaccines should be distributed and implemented. So maybe we're not going to read through all of the text because it's long. We've got quite a few, and we want to be able to allow for discussion as well. He does say, he compares it, he talks about the in the early lines about the mitzvah, when there was a war for a mitzvah, how a government, a nation could compel people to fight in battle because you need to do that because it's a mitzvah. And he says similarly, if you've got any other kind of situation of danger, if there's wild bears or lions and you've got to fight them, you can be Michal Shabbos, you break kind of all the regular priority list of halacha is restructured to cater for dealing with danger. And that's, he said, even things like that, it's considered a milchemes mitzvah, literally a war, a mitzvah battle. And he says, even though we no longer have a Jewish king, we don't have a Beis Din, and we do have a Beis Din. We don't have like a Beis Din like the Sanhedrin, as in the ultimate Supreme Court Beis Din. The leaders of the government could still compel, the government are duty bound to compel people to do the right thing. And he says, he says the battle against a pandemic, against a disease, should also be considered a milchemes mitzvah, literally a mitzvah battle. He says if we would have a Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin would probably paskin. This is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one of the greatest halachic minds of the last generation, saying if we would have the 71 member Sanhedrin, they would probably rule that a situation of a pandemic is equivalent to that of a country being attacked and almost like forced conscription to protect ourselves. It says, "Lochein bismaninu afshadai nase edi das Torah mikol mokim kimin shenase al kol panim ayidei mumchim gedolim bezehiras rabba mistaba she'in isod is nadin bekach." He says that even though he's talking about Israel in the last century, in the earlier days of the state, he says even though the state isn't run entirely along halachic lines, we have to listen to the government with what they say. And just like you have forced military conscription in Israel to deal with the dangerous realities of the military society there, he's advocating for something similar when it comes to tackling a health problem, if it's a dangerous health problem. So I say, based on what he's saying, and there are many other corroborating sources. I've just given you one example of this. It's clear that the government has the right to allocate vaccines to specific groups based on what it would determine to be a better overall outcome. Even if there's you could make an argument that there's a specific group which would have a greater need for it, and if you like, the individual claim to a vaccine wouldn't be as strong as kind of the government's responsibility to make sure that it's doing the best it can. Just like if you have a situation of a battle, of a military war, governments will sometimes have to take the unfortunate decision of prioritizing the needs of the greater country, even though it puts at risk, a greater risk, a specific group of individuals, be them the soldiers or the people on the front lines or whatever it might be. Similar decisions have to be made when looking at things from an organizational, structural perspective, and that's why I'm saying that our government guidelines of looking at the way they have done. Again, it's not for us to nitpick, but we should have an awareness and understanding that even if we don't agree with the detailed specifics of how they're going to allocate a vaccine, they do need to have a military strategy and a way of regulating it. So that's kind of the first part of the discussion. The second is looking at things almost from an individual priority. So say, okay, fine, we know the government has to go about doing this. What if I have managed to get hold of 1,000 little vials of the coronavirus vaccine? How do I go about giving them to my friends, family, sell them on the black market? So there is a fascinating and famous Gemara in Bava Metzia of Rabbi Yochanan says who says Rabbi Yochanan, he says the famous brisa, which will begin with Kedatanya, Shnayim shahayu mahalchim aderech. Two people are walking on a desert path. And only one of them has got a jar of water. So they're in the desert, there's nothing to drink. And I'm sure you're familiar with this scenario. They've got one jug of water, and it's small enough that that it's only got enough water for one of them to be able to survive. If they both share it, they are both not going to make it to their next destination. There's enough water to keep one of them alive, but not both. Dorish ben Batura, Mutav sheyishtu shneihem v'yamusu v'al yira echad meihem b'misasa shel chaveroi. So Ben Batura suggested that it's preferable that both of them drink the water and die, and let neither of them see the death of the other. He says, by drinking this water, you're essentially killing your friends. You don't want to do that. So share it, drink it, even if you know that means that both of you are going to die. Until Rabbi Akiva came along, and V'limeid b'chai ochicha imach. Rabbi Akiva says, and until Rabbi Akiva came and kind of teaches this, it seems that it was almost the apparent, again, I don't know if this ever was a practical discussion, but as is often the case in the Gemara, we discuss the theoretical realities so that we'll know what to do in that practical case, or if similar practical cases arise. Rabbi Akiva says, no, it says, your brother shall live with you, indicating that it's important to live. Your life takes precedence, so whoever has the jug of water should drink it. If you find yourself in a situation where you have a jug of water, and if you drink it, you'll stay alive, and if you don't, you won't, you have no business sharing that with someone else. It may be very nice that you don't, that you feel bad for those around you who don't have water, but says Rabbi Akiva, you've got to look at this the other way. You're killing yourself if you don't drink it. You have a responsibility. You've got a responsibility to do whatever you can to stay alive. And if you're in a situation where you have only a little bit of water and can keep yourself alive, you should do that. Yes, Adam.
I'm not sure this applies entirely to our case, because in this case we're discussing that we know for sure that both are going to die. When taking a vaccine, it's we are not knowing for sure that the guy who will not taking a vaccine will die. He will just will have an elevated risk of dying. It will be, I think that's not exactly the same case.
You're right. They're not exactly the same case, and that's one of the differences. There's another difference as well to that, which I've said in the next. But you're right. That's a very good point. Whereas in Rabbi Akiva's case, by not taking the vaccine, you're killing yourself. Now, by not taking the vaccine, you're endangering yourself. And there's a very important distinction there, where you're allowed to take a risk on balance if you feel it's the right thing for you to do in many areas, not if you know it's going to kill you. And Rabbi Akiva's example.
I'm taking a vaccine. I will be the first in row. I'm just.
No, you're right. And the example of the Gemara is the extreme case. And there, like either the lesson we see there is the importance of prioritizing your own life before someone else's. That if you like, even if it's coming from an altruistic place that you want to help other people, you can only help other people if you're alive to help them. So without yourself being alive, you're of no help to other people. So that's in its extreme situation. As you mentioned, with the vaccine, it's different. And in fact, Rabbi Professor Steenberg, who's written extensively on this and all other medical ethics from the Jewish perspective, mentioned this in an article he wrote, and I'll show you the next paragraph is something which he says, and he says this source is not relevant to our current concern. And he's got a slightly different reason to yours, but they both kind of refute this as a direct proof or disproof to how we should treat the coronavirus vaccine. He says, because since it relates to a situation with limited resources, which belong to one of the people who is himself in danger, whereas kind of the triage situation which we're discussing refers to an insufficient life-saving resources that belong to the entire community. Now that's what the truth, that we could actually change that scenario and say that you individually own them, but he's looking at it at the moment. He's saying at the moment no one owns any vaccines. They have been developed by labs. It's governments who are going to buy them, and yes, I have no doubt there'll be contracts given out, and people will be the go-betweens. And I'm sure the few people who happen to be positioned in the right place will do very well out of negotiating the contracts for the vaccines. But he's saying essentially public property. They've been developed for the public, and they're public property, and so there's a difference between maybe that his comment is slightly more relevant to the previous section where we're discussing it from a more communal perspective. But he's saying that if they belong to the public, then it's different. But let's say, okay, going back to a scenario, you've managed to get hold of your own 1,000 batches of the vaccine, and how you go about distributing them. The priority list would seem to be so far that you make sure you look after yourself first, because if you're in possession of them, in possession of them, then you've got to make sure that you look after your own health and well-being. it's interesting that this, this Gemara of Rabbi Akiva, we do paskin like that in case of real danger. And it also kind of forms the basis of our discussions for prioritizing tzedakah. The Shulchan Aruch says that when it comes to distributing tzedakah, your family comes first, and then the poor of your city. And the Ramah adds then that actually your own personal needs come before the needs even of your family. So if someone's in a situation where giving tzedakah is going to if they've only got just about the minimum amount to be able to live healthily, and giving anything away, even to those family members who are worse off than them, you've got to prioritize to make sure that you've got a livable standard before doing anything. Otherwise, like essentially, you need that tzedakah yourself, and it works out from there in terms of one's close family and then local community, in line with the teaching of Rabbi Akiva that you've got to look after your own personal well-being and that of your family, and then if you like, you have an outward spread of a circle of concern to make sure that you're going to be able to do that. So that would seem to be a standard way of kind of normally dishing out extra resources we have. And very possibly in a situation where one has access to something like a vaccine as well. I want to share with you a fascinating Gemara in Horayos. Let's learn it together and see if it's at all relevant today. So the Mishnah is talking about the priorities of saving someone's life. If you've got, this is, rather than saving yourself, let's assume that you're alive and well and healthy, and you're in a position to save someone else. So the Mishnah in Horayos, it says, Kohen Kohen Levi. A Kohen comes before a Levi. Levi Yisrael, and then a Levite becomes before Yisrael. Yisrael le Mamzer. Yisrael comes before someone who's born out of an adulterous relationship. Mamzer le Nosin. A Mamzer comes before a Nosin, the Gibeonites. Without going into the full background, they were a nation who kind of tricked their way into being accepted by the Jewish people at the time without really converting, and as such there was always a little bit of tension. I said that's a fascinating discussion as to the status or the Jewish status of a Nosin, and of course they would always be able to convert and become a regular member of the Jewish people, but without that, whether they with their status as a Nosin would be, so that this is the priority list. So that's, they already had that status. The ger le'eved, the nosin le'ger, and a nosin takes precedence over someone who had converted. The ger le'eved, a ger le'eved meshuchra, a convert precedes an emancipated slave. So this there's a priority list which there's half a dozen questions which we could look at and immediately ask. And I know I'm going to put those questions to one side because we're going to see where we get to at the end with it. When is this? Bizman shekulon shavim. When do these halachas of preference take effect? In circumstances when they are all equal in terms of wisdom, but im haya mamze tamil chacham v'kohen gadol am haaretz mamze tamil chacham koydem v'kohen gadol am haaretz. In a situation where you have a mamzer who is a Talmid Chacham and a high priest who is an ignoramus, then things get flipped around. So it's a fascinating mission. On the one hand, we start off by saying we've got this priority list. No, Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, and kind of it almost goes without saying that the Kohen Gadol would come before a regular Kohen. But almost, starting off from aristocratic perspective, you're saying, you've got your fixed aristocracy. This is how you should prioritize life saving. And then, like the very same paragraph we go into, but that's if they're all equal. And if they're not, then obviously there's a meritocracy which precedes any kind of aristocracy, if you like. And you won't be surprised to know that thousands of pages have been written discussing this Mishnah and trying to understand what it means and if it has any relevance today. So, well,
can I make the observation that whether it's relevant or not might well depend upon the effect of these vaccines on somebody who's taken the vaccine. I mean, their ability to transmit the virus, because if in fact these vaccines stop somebody from being a transmitter, that puts them much more into the same kind of category as saving their own life, which is what you're describing in terms of the Gemara. But if it turns out that these vaccines help protect the person, but don't stop them being a transmitter, so they are still potentially a vehicle for injuring all sorts of other people, then it becomes in a completely different kind of category.
You're right. That's a very good point. And as you say, at the moment, there's so little we know about how the vaccine will affect the vaccinated person in terms of their ability to transmit. I'm always looking at it from a theoretical perspective that once you take the vaccine, you're cured and you will no longer get coronavirus and you will no longer be able to transmit it. And I know that's not the black and white reality. But I've been, for argument's sake, viewing it like that. But you're right. If it turns out that with the vaccine, you're vaccinated, but you still have the ability to transmit it, that complicates things.
It most certainly, not only did it complicate things, but it actually almost turns on its head the kind of people you'd want to vaccinate. Because, for example, if in fact it doesn't stop transmission, then you may as well obviously focus on the people who are going to be most vulnerable and who could die from it. If, on the other hand, it does stop transmission, then really perhaps you should be focusing on those people who are capable of transmitting the most, which are probably the other end of the spectrum of people. For example, young people, school children who can go back to families, or university kids, etc., may need to be vaccinated first because they are primary transmitters.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And I guess once we know more about how the vaccine works, it's very likely that we'll see a fine-tuning and recalibration of government strategy as to how it's implemented. So this interesting kind of dynamic of the Mishnah, of starting with an aristocracy and then ending with a meritocracy, does that apply at all today? So I've shared with you, there's 3 different teshuvas from recent poskim who all kind of completely refute the Mishnah's thinking in terms of how we would do anything today. Which does beg the question, why is the Mishnah teaching this to us? And there's a good answer for that. It's possibly beyond the scope of today's discussion. But we'll see first with Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who we quoted earlier, who quotes this Mishnah, he says, Im yesh echad shevadai mesukon al pi harofim kadayim v'zeh sofek v'rofa achas ein mesukon l'shneihem. It says that obviously the doctors have to prioritize the greatest sakana, the greatest danger, and to make sure that they're addressing that. And he says, even though, despite, so he says, the ayin b'sof b'sefes horius. He says, I've obviously learned this mission horius of b'seidah shel adifus b'inyan hatzala m'shevi. He says, with regards to the priorities of rescuing someone from captivity, which the Mishnah is listing, and likewise the priority listings for giving to tzedakah. He says, Ulam lahav maskin neshama mechol achad shehu b'matzav yosef kasher sheyesh l'shnei. He says it's very different here. He talking nechoshev ha'ila rishon kvar zach maskin v'chol atzmai badei potzim. It says the reality here is very different, because the levels of danger with different people are very different. There, even with that, he's saying before getting on to the end of the Mishnah, where we say, that we kind of refute the aristocracy in terms of more of a meritocracy. He's saying that's assuming that you've got the very obvious scenario of that I can save one life. Let's say it's everyone's been taken captive, and the captors are saying for £1,000 you can redeem one of the hostages. You take your pick. Right, that's great. You've got a simple scenario. You can pay £1,000 and choose which one you want to take. It's not like that here. You've got various degrees of danger, and so it's that whole balance of decision making, is irrelevant because you have to see the most pressing needs. And then he ends up with a very interesting final line just before kind of he signs off his name. It says that. He says, but I'm telling you, he says, obviously he's addressing a specific concern with regard to giving out medical treatment on a widespread basis. But he says, I'm telling you something that this has to be understood. What's a masmorim? It means is the Hebrew for fixing nails. If I'm hanging, he says, I'm not nailing this to the wall. He says, everything that I'm writing, he says, is case specific to the discussion we're having. He says, he says, this is a very fluid situation. And the question you've asked me is, I've answered it based on all the knowledge I have to hand at the moment. But there's an understanding that this is a constantly changing medical situation. So I've explained it as best I know it now. I don't want you to fix this as a future halachic ruling, because I'm very aware of how fluid the situation here is, particular with regards to medicine development. And that's how he signs off. And if you like, that line is what has been fixed as a halachic ruling. That whenever we come to looking for halachic guidance from the poskim with regards to how we should address a situation like that, it always has to be taken in a situation, was this ruling given for all times, for all situations, or was it given for a specific situation which was very relevant to the medical world and what was going on in the world at the time. So based on what he says is that we definitely can't apply the rules of the Mishnah to pikuach nefesh situations in a contemporary society. The Rav Moshe Feinstein in the next source says something interesting as well. He says, "Vaday posh devarad yadu the kol ben Torah Yerushalayim shemichavin levros hatzal b'chol ma she'efshar." He says it's taken as a granted that anyone who can should save as much life as they could. And he says we kind of ignore both sides of the Mishnah. You may, he says it's irrelevant, whether you're the Kohen, the Am Haaretz Kohen Gadol, or the Talmid Chacham Mamzer, no matter how wise, how wealthy, how prestigious, how if you like, everyone's been talking about this virus as being a leveler, has affected everyone in society, and there was nothing you could do to buy protection from it. It got through any layer of societal barriers which we may have put between us. Rav Moshe Feinstein says when it comes to healing, when it comes to saving for things like that, none of the false barriers which we kind of erect in society should be taken into account. He says, "But in Kadima, even those which are mentioned in the Mishnah, he says, even if in a situation where a doctor has ample time to treat everyone, and in a theoretical scenario where you've got a doctor who's got half a dozen patients, they all need to be looked after, they all will survive and have got exactly the same situation and just need to be treated. He goes, then you can start thinking about Kadima, about prioritizing them, if everything else is equal. But he says, it says, but he goes, but practically it doesn't happen. Practically, you have a triage system where there's never a situation where two medical cases are alike. And the doctors are they're constantly kind of refreshing that triage to make sure that they are addressing the most needy situation of anything like that. So he says, yes, it might be a nice thought experiment to prioritize who we might like to prioritize if things were equal. Practically speaking, they aren't, so it isn't so relevant. Rav Herschel Schachter, who also quotes this Mishnah, he says that we've got this list of priorities in the Mishnah, and he says that the Mishnah is telling us we should try and prioritize the one who is going to contribute more to society. And in the times of the Mishnah, this list was reflective on the historical reality at the time. You're right, there's a previous which we haven't quoted this Mishnah, which before says that a man comes before a woman. That's in on another Mishnah in a similar page. And Rav Schachter is looking to try and, whereas the other Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach are saying the Mishnah's message isn't relevant to our reality. Rav Schachter is saying, right, it's taking that as a granted, but saying I still want to try and understand what the Mishnah is teaching us, because we have a tradition which we don't want to disregard in any way, that every Mishnah has got something important to teach us. So if this Mishnah doesn't make sense to us, we need to try and look at why and what the real message which we could learn from this Mishnah might be. So he says the reality of the times of the Mishnah is that this was if you like, a good balance of how people were expected to contribute towards society. He says nowadays there are clearly women who contribute more to society than men. It's possible that an 80-year-old, they contribute more to society in his remaining years than a 50-year-old in his remaining years. Therefore, this list can't be applied because we can't determine who should contribute more. But if you like, the message he is just giving us a way, if you've read this Mishnah and said, well, like, hold on a minute, this doesn't make any sense to me, it is possible to view it and realize that we should be prioritizing those who are able to contribute to society. And that goes in many areas. Like, if the government started giving out the vaccine to members of parliament first, I'm sure there are some people who say, well, that's unfair. That's a bit of why are they getting it before we do? But again, I'm not saying this is necessarily the right thing, but you could make a very strong case is that we need to have a functioning government in order to be able to, if every time a member of the government needs to self-isolate or go and take sick leave for 2 weeks, the country comes to a standstill, I want them healthy and well, and I want them to be able to do as best they can. I mean, I guess the obvious people in this are the key health workers. No one would want to deny them the resources before anyone else, because we need them to make sure that everyone else can be healthy. So we've got all these various ways of looking at the priority lists. And I guess what the message which this Mishnah is teaching us is that we shouldn't just give things out haphazardly. And wherever we're in a situation where there are limited resources and those resources are important, careful deliberation should go in to make sure that you prioritize these resources in a manner with which is going to have the maximum effect for the society with which you're able to control. And interesting, so we've looked at it, and if you like, in a scenario about how a government would go about deciding how to prioritize giving out its own resources of vaccines. How an individual might, who said you should prioritize your family first, yourself first, then your family, and then kind of expand outwards from there. You could take the decision a step further and and suggest like how if you like we're all very much aware we're part of a global community. This is something which affects the entire planet, not just Jewish, or wherever we happen to find ourselves. How would we want our country? How should a relatively affluent country like the UK be helping to implement vaccines in terms of aid, both financial and resource-wise, across the world? And in that regard, I think the Oxford vaccine has so far been the most, I guess, the most useful, because it's the easiest to, it's the cheapest to function in terms of both production and storage, and the easiest to ship around the world, to make sure that we're able to address a global problem rather than just an individual problem. So, we've been very fortunate that there have been so many, if you like, researchers working at this from all angles. Extending it to the next level, we should always view ourselves as individuals and as part of a society, and making sure that we're functioning well in both of those areas. Part of that thought process, should extend to, we should be a giving country as well as just a giving people. And so I guess that there's a certain amount of pride to be taken that the vaccine which was researched and developed here is one which will hopefully have a global benefit. And ultimately, that's important to us, because if the virus is still prevalent anywhere in the world, it will come back to bite us again. So this is something which we want to be able to address on a global perspective, as well as a national and communal and individual perspective as well. I know I've been talking for a while and read through it all. Any other comments, suggestions, thoughts? Happy to hear anyone else thinking on this.
Can I just make a general comment, if I may? Sure. We shouldn't lose sight in any of this. In the day and age that we live, we should give thanks to Hashem that endowed the human race with a level of wisdom from which the human race can benefit so rapidly to get out of a situation which hundreds of years ago we might have been locked into for far longer.
You're right. It's definitely something which we shouldn't take for granted, that if you look at the effects the Spanish flu had 100 years ago, and in any other situation like this in previous historical times, it would have decimated the population. And yes, this has been we shouldn't belittle the effect this has had, but we should give thanks to Hashem that we're blessed with a society with wisdom that has allowed us to negate the effects and to work on a system of being able to get out of this. Yeah, very relevant point.
Yeah. Do you want to say hello to someone?
Any other comments or suggestions?
No, very nice.
Very nice, yeah.
Oh, thanks, Davi.
It wasn't very nice, yeah.
It's lovely to see you. Lovely to see you joining in, participating, and yeah, it's.
Well, Rabbi Binstock, can I deduce from what you've said so far that you would not be standing up objecting if the government were at some stage to say that it was compulsory to immunize with this vaccine?
I wouldn't object to that. And obviously, if the government did that, there would have to be a bit more, like, if you like, research done to check that there are no harmful side effects. I think part of the reason they're not able to do that is because it's so new. But assuming we get to a situation where we know this is a safe vaccine or is of similar level to something like the flu vaccine, I wouldn't object to it being made compulsory. I guess that any sensible government would say it's compulsory kind of within reason, because you can't make something compulsory, because I'm sure there are some people who could be allergic to specifics of the vaccine. And before you go to for a flu jab, they ask you half a dozen questions. And again, it's not for everyone, even though it's for almost everyone. So it's difficult to say, like, again, that would be an interesting moral dilemma. If you'd have someone who, for whatever reason, would be allergic to the vaccine, or we know it would cause harm to them, but if they didn't take it, they'd be causing harm to others.
Exactly.
How such a person should conduct themselves.
Yes.
And the likely way of navigating that is saying, okay, if it's going to be harmful for, you know, for the person in question to take the vaccine, they shouldn't take it, but they've got to live with the reality of knowing that that they might be spreading it, and have got to mitigate that. They've got to take personal responsibility for wearing a mask and possibly gloves in public until there's enough herd immunity. So with any situation like that, if you're going to say, I don't want to take a vaccine, but I'm going to make sure to sensibly mitigate any risks, that's one thing. To say, I'm not going to take a vaccine, I'm going to go about my life as normal and spread this to many others, that's irresponsible, and that has got to be stopped. It's difficult to enforce stopping that. But again, that's something which should be compelled in any way.
In your experience, is there any halakhic justification at all for a scenario where you would actually be able to impose vaccination on somebody to save lives, even though it does cause non-life-threatening side effects? In other words, there are going to potentially be risks, but for some people, and statistically there would be a tiny percentage, but it could do so. Halakhically, would that cause you a problem?
It becomes a very interesting discussion. So let's just take it to its extreme, and let's say if we had 1,000 people, and if we know that like, even if you could do a test that there's 999 of them are neither, well, they all need the vaccine, 999 will be fine, but there's one guy within the group that if we give him the vaccine, it's going to kill him. If we give no one the vaccine, 50% of them are going to die from the virus. We can't kill one person to save 999, to save 500. That's with the, if you like, knowing that giving this vaccine is going to kill him, it might as well kill him straight away then. He's not going to spread the virus. But that's taking the scenario to its extreme. If it's going to make someone sick, it becomes a very sensitive question, because we don't quite know what the side effects are. It will be very difficult to enforce someone to take a vaccine which is going to give them harmful side effects for the sake of a wider society. We'd have to find a way of making sure that they could be not spreading it to wider society. But you're right, it becomes a very difficult question, because at what stage, okay, if there's I think where the level of the vaccine are, anything which gets past the current guidelines, I don't know exactly where they draw the line, but there's no serious side effects. Anything which the medical bodies would agree is not a serious side effect, you don't have to worry about. Okay, so sometimes they say you might get a headache, a bit of soreness in limbs from the current vaccine. You might get a mild bout of flu from taking the flu vaccine. That's allowed. That kind of falls within that. Once you start having more serious risks, then it becomes more dangerous. So to compel someone to take a vaccine, if it's going to cause them serious risk, no. If it's going to cause them possible minor side effects, yes. And where you draw the line in between the two is very case specific.
Thank you.
Hope that helps.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so that's kind of just a bit of a thought. Again, there's so much more which could be discussed there, but I wanted to look at it at a couple of laws, particularly as if you like the first point, just to summarize very briefly. We saw that the importance the Gemara places on invisible public danger. That glowing piece of metal in the public, which you could break Shabbos, more than a visible public danger, because we're worried about the consequences. That's the first thing to bear in mind. The need for a society to prioritize to come up with a system. How, when it comes to a purely individual perspective, we should allocate our needs of life-saving treatment first to ourselves, then our families, and then expand out within there to a wider circle of influence based on our resources to be able to do so. And also from the kind of the meritocracy perspective, although we've been given guidelines for that in the Mishnah, they're not relevant today. And we should be viewing them, if you like, as from a perspective of how best people would be able to contribute towards society, and making sure that those who are able to do so are given the all necessary access to life-saving treatment. So, thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
To see you all.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
And hopefully it won't be too long until we can meet up again in person.
Thank you. Very well. I hope all goes well with Leanne. Let us know.
Thanks.
Okay, say hello from me to her, yeah?
I will do.
All right.
Nice to see you, Rabbi. Same as well.
To see you, Johnny.
Please send my best. I'm really excited. Please, God.
Thanks. Will do.
See you, Danny.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. See you.
Bye, Warren. Bye. Bye, Evelyn. Good. I didn't see you there before. Nice to see you. How are you keeping?
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
It's been one of those days.
Yeah. How are you keeping?
Okay, I'm fine.
Oh.
But the side effects are really nothing to worry about, because I once had some tablets given to me. In the first paragraph, it said side effects might give you constipation. In the next paragraph, it said side effects might give you diarrhea. I didn't bother to read the third paragraph.
Exactly. Once you got those two, who knows what?
I don't think they would do a vaccine that's not safe, I think.
Yeah, I said once it gets past this stage,
somebody who's going to fall flat.
I think once it's right, it will be safe. They will make sure
I have the flu vaccine at any rate.
Yeah.
Which is a bit pointless because I never got flu in the first place.
Take care anyway.
Yeah.
See you, Binstock.
Okay. See you. All right. Lovely seeing you all.
I'm glad to how you're doing in Manchester.
Thank God we're doing very well.
Yeah. Of course, it's a good place to come from. My mother was a Manchester girl.
Ah, okay.
See you, Binstock.
All right. Have a great day. All the very best.
See you.
See you.
See you. Bye. Bye, Kenny. I can't hear you, Kenny. You're on mute. I can't hear you on mute.
They have a good day.
It's a very good show, wasn't it, Kenny?
Superb. Rabbi Binstock's outstanding. Know that.
Top, never top. That's right.
Well, as some people say, it'll last from Panis Esther to Purim.
Say that again, I missed that. Say that again.
It'll last from Panis Esther to Purim.
We'll see.
We will see.
I know.
Enjoy. Enjoy it while it lasts.
I know. I don't expect it to last either in reality.
Have a good day.
And you. Be well. See you, Kenny. Be well. See you. See you, Kenny.